Welcome back to Proxamer, everybody, and today we're going to be looking at a video covering a far-flung Craftworld trait combination. Many of you might have heard of this. It is the Swift Strikes and Masterful shots far-flung trait combo. Now, this is a combination that has had some success at the competitive level in tournaments and things like that, using units like Swooping Hawks, using units like Shroud Runners and stuff to basically extend the movement range of those units and allow them to get into threat range of things that were out of line of sight, essentially, before. And then, of course, jump back to safety using the Battle Focus special rule, or in some cases, if you're using Swooping Hawks or something like that, you could use Sky Leap as well. And while Swooping Hawks did get a points increase, I do think that Swift Strikes and Masterful shots is still a great combination outside of Swooping Hawks. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take a deep dive into this Craftworld trait combination, and we're going to be looking at the best ways to utilize an army using these traits. So a quick overview of the video, we're going to be looking at both the Swift Strikes and Masterful shots far-flung traits. We're going to be talking about why the trait combination is so powerful, what has made this combo even better in Arcs of Omen, because I actually do think it has become more versatile and probably slightly improved in Arcs of Omen. We're going to be looking at which units make best use of the far-flung combo, and I'm going to be giving you an example 2,000 point Swift Strikes and Masterful shots army list and the general strategy behind it, which heavily revolves around getting line of sight on enemy units early on, and also being able to score on things like line breaker, or excuse me, I should say behind enemy lines, of course, and things like that. So the first trait is Masterful Shot. So this is pretty straightforward. Basically, your army just ignores light cover when shooting, but this is exceptionally fantastic because most boards are going to have a plethora of light cover, and some units even get bonuses if they are in light cover and things like that. So being able to ignore it is going to be a pretty powerful trait overall for your entire army. And basically just increases the punching power of your units being able to ignore light cover. Things like scatter lasers will still kill Marines on a 1 or a 2 versus a 2+, which makes a big difference. And it's basically useful on just about every shooting unit. So it's a solid trait. You don't need to really use reveal or things like that much, which you would normally use in another list to get rid of light cover, which makes it just a great overall pick. However, when this is combined with Swift Strikes, it becomes exceptionally powerful. So Swift Strikes basically is a little bit hard to understand at first because it's worded very weird and there's a lot of things you have to know about the remaining stationary rule and how that works. But essentially, it allows for a couple things. So first of all, it allows for the use of Battle Focus in the same turn you made in advance, which for a lot of our units means that we can we can move, advance D6, or in some cases just a full 6 inches, and then we can use Battle Focus on top of that, which is insane. The next thing it does is it allows units to advance and shoot heavy weapons without penalty as long as there is at least one assault weapon or pistol in the unit. So as long as that unit is eligible to shoot in the first place, because of a weird rule in the rule book, a unit that has only heavy weapons won't be eligible to shoot if it moves and advances. So it needs to have at least a pistol or an assault weapon in there somewhere to be eligible. But if it has that, you can advance and shoot heavy weapons without penalty. And this also means that you can just, with any unit, move and fire heavy weapons without penalty. So even though Dark Reapers aren't that powerful of a unit, they benefit from Swift Strikes decently well. It basically means it can move and shoot without the -1 to hit. And basically, overall, what this achieves is it increases the threat range for all units with Battle Focus and allows you to get great angles on enemy units behind terrain. So one of the things that I think Eldar kind of lack, and this was basically purposeful on GW's part, we lack a really hard-hitting unit that can take out things from behind terrain. So we basically don't have any hard-hitting artillery that has a long range. The closest thing to this is the Shadow Weavers and the Night Spinner, but both of those are not great against heavier targets. So what Swift Strikes allows us to do is it allows us to use fast units and make them even faster, essentially, so that we can hit those units behind those obscuring terrain pieces, and we can essentially eliminate those targets from the game. So why is this trait combination so powerful? So basically, like I said before, it opens up more opportunities to get to the next piece of terrain or reposition at a threat range while doing solid damage. So it increases our slipperiness, so to speak, and at the same time, it increases our ability to do damage against enemy units. And particularly, it allows certain units to score things like behind enemy lines on turn 1. So this is something that a lot of players, I think, overlook. Because depending on the setup of the battlefield, you may actually be able to score behind enemy lines anyway, turn 1, if it's a diagonal deployment or something like that. But check this out. So basically, what this allows you to do is move 22 inches with certain jet bike units, plus D6 inches while still being able to do damage, and that is something Quicken cannot do. So normally we could just use Quicken on a small unit like that, get in the enemy deployment zone, and score that now 3 victory point. But with Swift Strikes, we can actually do this while doing damage at the same time. So just imagine that you are, your unit of 3 Wind Riders or your unit of 3 Shroud Runners wants to get into the enemy deployment zone and take out a key target, Imperial Guard target, or wants to eliminate a unit of cultists or something like that. Now you can do that from turn 1 instead of having to basically just sacrifice that unit for nothing. And at the same time, if you are using Shroud Runners, during the enemy's movement phase or charge phase, you can actually use that Wire Weave Grenade stratagem and do D3 mortal wounds to them and reduce their movement. So basically, that unit of Shroud Runners, that unit of 3 that costs 90 points, can take out a chaff unit or do damage to a heavier infantry unit, whatever you wish. And on top of that, it can also mess up your enemy's movement. And honestly, a lot of times this can actually prevent faster units from getting to objectives turn 1, which can be a big control factor in a game that, you're wanting to basically control the objectives in, right? So the versatility of this essentially makes this trait very powerful and very useful in a number of situations against a vast majority of enemy armies. So what has made this combo better in Arcs of Omen? So some people might say that it's maybe a little bit worse now because Swooping Hawks got a points increase, and Swooping Hawks were arguably one of the best units to use Swift Strikes with because they could essentially move up to 20 inches in the movement phase, shoot something, and then basically just skyleap wherever they wanted. So it was kind of like a really heavily uninteractive type of list with Swift Strikes where you'd have like a bunch of Swooping Hawks moving up to 20 inches sometimes a turn, or 14 plus D6 if you didn't have the Strains of Fate advance roll available. You'd shoot an enemy unit pretty hard with, Guy, Doom, Jinx, and of course you have also Masterful Shots, so you're ignoring their light cover. You'd obliterate that unit or whatever it was, and then you would disappear behind obscuring terrain across the other side of the board. So if you want to still do that, you're going to have to pay a lot more points for it, Swooping Hawks being 5 more points a model. If you're using 3 units of Hawks, that's going to be an equivalent of about 150 more points. So that's a lot more expensive. However, because Craftworld Eldar can now easily take up to 6 fast attack choices, all which benefit greatly from Swift Strikes and Masterful Shots, I think that even though Swooping Hawks got nerfed, we have a lot of other great options for Swift Strikes, which I will go into in a second. And also, the fact that Space Marine factions lost Armor of Contempt has made it easier for the units that benefit most from this combo to eliminate their targets much easier before disappearing to safety. So things like Warp Spiders, things like Wind Rider jet bikes with shuriken catapults and things like that are able to more quickly eliminate their targets before disappearing with battle focus and basically just not being able to be targeted back that easily. So which units make best use of the far-flung combo? So I've went into some of these, and honestly, a lot of our shooting units make great use of this combo in general. But the ones that stand out to me are Shroud Runners, Wind Riders, Warp Spiders, Swooping Hawks, of course, and Vipers. And real quick, before we go into these units, Ride the Wind is the ability that allows the unit to auto-advance 6 inches instead of D6. This ability is on basically every jet bike model and Vipers. So instead of advancing d6, you can actually just move the full 6 inches. So Shroud Runners are one of the best units, in my opinion, that work well with Swift Strikes because not only are they extremely fast and long range with their weapons, they can basically move 22 inches plus d6 and still shoot. They also have a pre-game move on top of this and can essentially be in the enemy's backline turn 1, roasting their most vulnerable units and at the same time scoring on secondary objectives like behind enemy lines and disrupting enemy movement. This, combined with the fact that they recently got a points reduction, means that these guys are very cost effective for what they can do. The next unit that benefits well from Swift Strikes is the Wind Riders. So the Scatter Laser Wind Riders obviously are much worse than the Shroud Runners in almost every way. Currently, because they are 30 points a model just like the Shroud Runners, which doesn't make a whole lot of internal balance sense, but hey, GW will do as GW does. So just like the Shroud Runners though, they can move 22 inches plus d6 inches and still shoot, and they're also great for movement sheets and objective play. So you can have a unit of 3 of these, turn 1, also be able to get into the enemy deployment zone on certain maps. So in certain deployments, these guys can indeed get into the enemy deployment zone by moving 22 inches and then battle focusing d6. Of course, you don't want to roll that 1 for battle focus, right? But they can still do very decently if your enemy is not screening you out very heavily. And other than that, if you do want to save them until the late game, they can make a jump for an objective across the field, get on the objective by essentially doing this. Now, this is a little bit of a trick that a lot of you guys might not be aware of, but I just want to kind of go into it really quick while we're talking about Wind Riders. Now, Scatter Lasers aren't a very common pick, but if you have a unit of 3 of these and you give one a Scatter Laser, even if the Shuriken Catapults are out of range of something, let's say it's in the late game and all of the enemy units are either hidden or going to be out of range of your Shuriken Catapults. So you want to make sure that your, Wind Riders can get on an objective across the field, but the path of movement that you would take would put you out of Shuriken Catapult range. So if you are out of Shuriken Catapult range, you can't battle focus. Do you see where I'm going with this? So that can essentially deny d6 inches worth of movement from your Wind Riders. So what you do is you give a single jet bike in the unit a Scatter Laser. So normally this wouldn't be a good idea because, again, in normal lists, you can't advance and shoot heavy weapons, right? But in a Swift Strikes list, you can actually advance, and because the unit also has assault weapons in it, you can still fire that Scatter Laser at a target that's in range of that weapon, which means that you can use battle focus. So let's give you a quick example. You move 22 inches and you're just outside of the range of the objective that you needed to get to, and no enemy unit is within 18 inches of your unit of Wind Riders. Let's say you maybe need 2 inches on a battle focus roll, which is pretty easy to get. However, there might not be any enemies within 18, but there's an enemy within 36 inches of that weapon, which means that you can use battle focus. So let's give you a quick example. You move 22 inches and you're just outside of the range of the objective that you needed to get to, and no enemy unit is within 18 inches of your unit of Wind Riders. Let's say you maybe need 2 inches on a battle focus roll, which is pretty easy to get. However, there might not be any enemies within 18, but there's an enemy within 36 inches. So, because you have assault weapons in the unit, you are eligible to shoot that Scatter Laser. You shoot that enemy unit within 36 inches, and then you can make your battle focus move onto the objective. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. You might not see this in a lot of builds, but in a Swift Strikes build, it actually makes sense for a late game objective holder. It might not come up that often in games, but for an extra 10 points, it can assure that you are able to get on those objectives, and you can make plans around this, right? You can make plans around putting your Wind Riders just maybe, 24 inches away from an objective behind some obscuring terrain, and therefore you can plan that out so that you can capture that objective in the late game without having to use Quicken. So, because remember, again, your Quicken might be not usable that turn. Maybe you have to use it to use Warp Ritual or something like that. So having those objective options available to you is a very important part of playing a Swift Strikes list. Warp Spiders are also arguably one of the better units to use with Swift Strikes because they can move 12 inches plus a d6 advance, which can turn into a 6 if you have a Strands of Fate roll for it, and a 2d6 battle focus on top of that, or you can use Web of Deceit. So these guys are kind of like Swooping Hawks in that way, right? And that's why I think that in a lot of ways, the Swooping Hawk nerf doesn't exactly kill Swift Strikes completely, because Warp Spiders can also use Web of Deceit, which is like a once-a-game Sky Leap. So you can move forward basically 18 inches with these guys. Now, they don't have as much threat range as, let's say, Swooping Hawks, right? But they do have a pretty significant threat range, and they do have the Web of Deceit ability, which means they can essentially Sky Leap back if they wanted to. And this vastly increases their threat range, and they're still, again, able to use Battle Focus and Web of Deceit on top of that with the addition of Swift Strikes. And Masterful Shots actually helps these guys out a lot too. With the addition of the loss of Armor of Contempt, these guys can hit a Space Marine unit in a piece of terrain at -2 AP and basically slaughter them, right? A big squad of Warp Spiders like this will absolutely devastate multiple squads of Space Marines, regardless of whether they're in cover or not, and then can jump back to safety either using Battle Focus or, of course, Web of Deceit. And to be honest with you, most of the time in the early game, you want to use Web of Deceit. You only really want to use the Battle Focus in the later mid-game and late game when, there's not as many units on the table that can draw line of sight to you. And moving on to Swooping Hawks. Swooping Hawks are also an excellent unit for Swift Strike. So a lot of people were spamming these in Swift Strikes lists because they were just so good at being able to get angles on enemy units, shoot them with the right buffs, being able to kill them, and then essentially use Sky Leap to jump back to safety. With the points increases, though, you're probably not going to see as many players running these in, units of 10 and things like that. And I think, people are running anywhere from, 18 to 24 to, sometimes even 30 Swooping Hawks in a Swift Strikes list, because they were just so uninteractive that your opponent couldn't really do much about it if he wanted to. Now, between you and me, I still think Swooping Hawks are pretty devastating in a Swift Strikes list. If you run a unit of 10, you do have to pay a little bit more tax for them, about 50 more points, but this can easily be offset by the amount of troops that you don't have to take now due to the changes in the detachments in Arcs of Omen. So you can still run a unit of these and relatively be okay. The people who are spamming them, however, you're probably not going to be able to get away with that because that's just too many points that you have to spend additionally. And point for point, Swooping Hawks are no longer going to be hitting as hard as they once were. So that is something you have to consider. But, I have to say they still make an excellent unit in a Swift Strikes Masterful Shots list. And the last is the Viper. So not many people will think about a Viper in a Swift Strikes list, but they're actually pretty good, I have to say. 40 points, and they can move 16 plus 6 inches and still shoot at full ballistic skill. So these guys are great for screening objectives and getting good angles on weak targets. And the cool thing about these as well is because you can move 16 plus 6 and still shoot, you can actually threaten units that would normally not be able to be threatened by this thing. And also, you can get into a position that can block enemies much easier while still doing damage. So it is 40 points. You do want to be able to shoot this thing at some point in the game. And with Swift Strikes, it actually kind of opens up some other shooting options. So if you wanted a little bit of an extra anti-tank weaponry in your list, you can bring a couple of Vipers with Bright Lances. It's not that many additional points. And in Swift Strikes, you can shoot them and also perform screening and objective duties at the same time, which is absolutely incredible for a very cheap model like the Viper. Which, by the way, we kind of have more room to field now because of the changes in the Arcs of Omen detachment. Okay, so like I said, I am going to show you guys an example 2,000 point Swift Strikes and Masterful Shots list. This is the one that I've been running since the changes. I've only run it a couple times, to be honest. I made some tweaks in it. It did have a unit of Swooping Hawks before. I decided that in this particular list, I wasn't going to run Swooping Hawks, but I am going to kind of go through the list and tell you guys about the general strategy behind each unit and what I hope to achieve with it. So for our HQ, we have a Farseer Skyrunner with a Singing Spear, Guide, and Fortune. We have another Farseer Skyrunner with Will of Azurian and Doom. So the Farseer Skyrunner with the Guide and Fortune is basically a backline, quote-unquote, Farseer that is deployed with the Shroud Runners and things like that. His job is to guide units as needed, either the Warp Spiders, which I'll kind of go over in a second, Shroud Runners, or other units that might need it. And he also has Fortune. So many people might look at that and think, well, that's kind of a weird option for a list that is basically primarily designed to kill enemy units. But here's the thing. Fortune can actually make a couple of the units in this list very very difficult to deal with when also out of line of sight for most of their army. So maybe only one or two units from their list can actually see that particular unit, which means that Fortune is going to have a lot more mileage on those units when they're not being targeted by the whole enemy army. We also have a Farseer Skyrunner who has Will of Azurian and Doom. Doom, of course, is to increase the damage against a particular target, but Will of Azurian is a utility power that is meant to give a unit objective secured. So a lot of units in this army do not have objective secured, but actually would really benefit greatly from having it. So for example, a smaller unit of Shroud Runners or Wind Riders could utilize this very well to take away enemy objectives and also score on secondary objectives like Scout the Enemy. So it could perform Scout the Enemy in the middle of the battlefield while on an objective and still shoot at the same time. Pretty good combination and a good thing to have in your back pocket. We also have an Autarch. Now, I'm going to go over the build for this Autarch and the reasons why I actually included it in this list. Because this thing looks really kind of funky, right? I mean, it has a Reaper launcher, a Starglaive, a Howling Banshee mask, and Swooping Hawk wings, plus the Falcon Swiftness and Phoenix Gem. It looks like it's all over the place. It looks like it wants to do a little bit of everything. But that's exactly what I wanted to do. So the Autarch's purpose in this list is to hang back with one of the units of Shroud Runners so that that opens up Guide from the Farseer to use it on a unit of Warp Spiders or Dire Avengers. Or just basically any unit which I really need to have Guide on that turn. So he does have a Reaper launcher. Now the Reaper launcher is meant to basically just be a long-range weapon so that he can utilize his battle focus easier. Again, the Falcon Swiftness basically gives him an automatic 6-inch battle focus move. So check this out. The Autarch sticks with the Shroud Runners. And he can actually keep up with them because he has the Swooping Hawk wings plus the 2 inches for the Falcon Swiftness. So he can keep up with Shroud Runners in the backfield. He can shoot at enemy units, long range, down the field, while buffing the Shroud Runners. And then, of course, he can use his 6-inch battle focus to basically go in and out of terrain without having to worry about, getting caught out or rolling a 1 or something like that. He does also have the Howling Banshee mask. So the Howling Banshee mask, basically, is there much of a point to it? Probably not. It's not a huge deal. But what it does do is it allows him to get into the action himself when he needs to. So he's very quick. He moves 6 inches normally and then can charge 2d6. And of course, a Strands of Fate roll on a charge roll is always useful for that. He can get in there and actually kill the unit of Marines if he wants to. Or if something charges into the Shroud Runners and they can't quite kill it with Overwatch, he can heroically intervene and he can deal some damage to them and make sure that the Shroud Runners can get away alive. So that's the purpose of the Autarch. He's basically a defensive tool that can also be used as an offensive tool later in the game when there's less enemies on the board. And he does also have the Phoenix Gem. So if the enemies do manage to kill him while he's on an objective or something like that, he can use the Phoenix Gem to get back in the action and actually still capture that objective. So again, great tool for the late game, buffs units throughout the game, and not for nothing, but he does give you an extra command reroll if you need it per phase, which isn't the best thing in the world, but sometimes it does help out, especially in the later stages of the game where you really need a reroll. For our elites, we have a Warlock Skyrunner with Protect and Jinx. We have a Warlock Skyrunner with Quicken Restrain and a Warlock Skyrunner with Conceal Reveal. But wait, Proxhammer, why are you using Conceal Reveal when your whole army ignores cover anyway? Well, good question. It's not for the reveal part of it. It's actually for conceal. So conceal is a great ability to basically put on a unit of Shroud Runners so that they can benefit from cover when they go onto an objective in the later stages of the game. So basically, I have a unit of Shroud Runners in this list that I always aim to use in the later stages of the game to sit on objectives. Having access to protect, conceal, and also fortune is a great way to keep a unit of Shroud Runners alive long enough to be able to capture an objective. And basically, yes, you're sinking a lot of psychic powers into this unit, and there might be some failures now and again. You know, especially with Warlock powers, not all of them are going to go off and things like that, but it is going to guarantee that you're going to have at least 1 or 2 defensive buffs on your Shroud Runners to be able to survive on an objective outside of cover in the later stages of the game when you really need it. So Eldar are kind of a squishy faction. They don't rely much on survivability. They rely a lot on speed. But in the later game, you kind of have to sometimes just be able to survive, right? You need a unit that can do that. And Shroud Runners, with Fortune, Conceal, and Protect, can actually be really survivable. So just think about it for a second. You cast Conceal on them. That basically gives them a +2 because not only are they getting +1 for light cover, but they're also getting an additional +1 from their Ranger Cloak ability, which gives them +1 save whenever they're benefiting from cover. So you're getting +2 to your armor save, which puts them at a 2+ save. With Protect, they can get a 1+, which of course 1s always still fail, but this will help against high AP weapons. And Fortune on top of that. So theoretically, this unit can be very tough, and they have 3 wounds apiece at toughness 4. So they're a little bit more resilient to anti-infantry fire than normal Craftworld Eldar units, and they do have an extra wound per model. So, you know, I mean, again, these guys can be relatively tough, especially if you are banking Strands of Fate rolls for saves and things like that. They can be a very decent and tough unit. Okay, so that's why I picked up Conceal. Quicken and Restrain, of course, is for the War Patrol secondary objective, which is now currently my favorite psychic objective for Eldar. It's very easy to basically get 12 points on. Psychic Interrogation is much harder to get off. You're probably rarely going to max out the points on it. Even though there's a command point bonus for getting it off, you need line of sight. It's a little bit harder to cast. And overall, it's just not going to be able to really max out your points anymore very easily. And of course, you also need to have a character within range to use it as well. And Scry Futures, let's be honest, guys. Scry Futures is just not that good, especially in several missions that don't have enough objectives. It's just not going to be that effective. Okay, so moving on to the Fire Dragons. We have 2 units of Fire Dragons in this list. And both of these units are meant to be kept in strategic reserve. Now, you could deploy them normally because, to be honest with you, unless your opponent has a lot of heavy indirect fire weapons, these guys can hide pretty effectively behind terrain and never be targeted. And they can jump out. One of the units has Blazing Fury, so has 16 inches of range, so pretty good. And remember, these guys can also advance and battle focus in the same turn because they are in a Swift Strikes list. So if you have an enemy unit that, you know, encroaches too close to an objective, you can move these guys forward, shoot them, and then move back with battle focus. Some of the times. Not all the time, of course. Fire Dragons have a very short range, so you might not be able to battle focus back. But with the unit that has a Blazing Fury, you're going to often be able to do this on at least one objective. The other unit you can hold in reserve and just use that as a trading unit. And basically just to trade with a heavy enemy vehicle, and basically that's it, right? You trade with an enemy vehicle and then your Fire Dragons are probably going to die. But usually this is part of a larger push where you're pushing, you know, their infantry units in the area as well. And that way your Fire Dragons, even though they will probably still die, their death is not going to be in vain because you're going to basically capture that side of the board in a coordinated strike. So that's why there's 2 units of Fire Dragons in this list. And it may seem a little bit off because Fire Dragons aren't necessarily a unit you think, oh, these guys are great in Swift Strikes. But they're actually pretty good at trading with vehicles. And especially now, I think you're going to see more vehicles in the meta appear because a lot of Space Marine vehicles got hefty cost reductions. However, Fire Dragons still trade very points efficiently with a lot of Space Marine vehicles. So for example, Fire Dragons at 120 points trade very well with things like Predators, Redemptor Dreadnoughts, things like that are around the same cost. Fire Dragons can pretty easily take those out in one round of shooting, and then your enemy is forced to react and either has to waste firepower killing the Fire Dragons, which aren't really that tough, but they are tougher than normal Eldar. Or in an optimal scenario, you'll be able to actually battle focus enough back to get behind obscuring terrain once again. So either way, I think Fire Dragons are a pretty good inclusion in this type of list. Then lastly, we have 10 Dire Avengers with the Shredding Fire, Exarch Power, and the additional Avenger Shuriken Catapult. That comes in at 155 points. So this unit is going to be normally just kept in Strategic Reserve, especially on boards that don't have a whole lot of terrain to hide your units. I mean, we do have other units to hide. You can't fit everything, your whole army, behind a couple pieces of obscuring terrain. But these guys can basically come into the board. They can light something up very fiercely. You can use Guide on them. You can cast Doom on an enemy unit, and these guys can do very significant damage. And they trade very well against lighter targets as well. So a unit of 10 of these against, for example, 2 units of Imperial Guardsmen, if you split fire with them, they can actually kill both units pretty dead, especially with Guide. So if you throw Guide on them, and you basically split fire at 2 units of Imperial Guardsmen, which will be about worth 130 points, you can kill both units fairly easily. And again, I know that's not exactly quite cost effective because 2 Imperial Guard squads only cost 130 points for both, but it is a good way of clearing out infantry, and sometimes getting just under your points cost is effective because your enemy is also going to have to point their guns back at you. And especially if you're supporting your Dire Avengers with other units and making sure that you don't make it easy for your opponent to counterattack the Dire Avengers without taking even more damage the next turn, it's worth it for helping to control the board and eliminate enemy targets. For our fast attack, we have 5 Shroud Runners, basically just meant to, again, like I said before, shoot enemy units long range in the early game, stay behind obscuring terrain, and then, of course, when needed, jump onto an objective and become very strong and very tough in the late game. We have a unit of 3 Shroud Runners as well. Now, this unit is actually designed for one specific purpose in mind, and that is a first turn victory point machine. So basically what you do with this unit is you use its pre-game move. Then if you get the first turn, you move into the enemy deployment zone using an advance as well as a battle focus roll, because you can do that, to shoot an enemy unit that's behind their obscuring terrain, which you can do unless they screen very well, which again, unless they're running some sort of horde list, it's going to be extremely hard to do that. And when you're in the enemy deployment zone, and by the way, you can get very deep within the enemy deployment zone using this strategy, you can then shoot an enemy unit in the back. And even though if you don't kill it, let's say you're fighting Space Marines and you don't kill the unit because, let's be honest, scatter lasers and a Ranger long rifle, especially in a minimum unit of Shroud Runners without buffs, isn't going to devastate a Space Marine squad. You may kill a couple of Marines on average. I would say you probably kill about 2. Because also remember, you are ignoring light cover, right? So you are going to be getting a little bit more damage from that. But maybe you kill 2, maybe 3 if you're lucky. And then what you can do is during the enemy turn, if they have a high priority fast target that wants to move out, you can use Wire Weave grenades on them and reduce their movement by D3. And also do some mortal wounds to them as well. However, that's not all. In this type of list, I, for one, often take behind enemy lines. So you can get 3 points on the now new and improved behind enemy lines. Now you only need 1 unit in their deployment zone to score 3 points. If you have 2 units, you still get the 4 points. But this allows the Shroud Runners to score victory points, mess with enemy movement, and at the same time hit something that was out of line of sight. So this can actually be a high priority target. This can be something like Devastator Marines, or this could be something that the rest of your army wouldn't be able to deal with behind terrain, like a unit of cultists or something like that. And if your enemy doesn't deploy correctly, it can even be something like a character. You can actually character snipe lesser characters like commissars and stuff if you position your Shroud Runners correctly, which you do have more than enough movement to do. And at the same time, again, like I said, score victory points. So will your Shroud Runners die from doing this? Yes, absolutely they'll die, of course. But they're going to create so much disruption in the process that their sacrifice is going to be more than worth it 100% of the time, if you're able to actually get those victory points and do that. And on top of that, depending on how your opponent deploys his units, you can actually position this unit in a way which physically blocks their models from moving past you. So there's a couple of scenarios where you can kind of deploy on the edge of an obscuring terrain piece and totally block enemy units from moving past it so that they can get on middle ground objectives in no man's land. And let me tell you, I've done this a few times and it's really worked wonders. I didn't think it was going to be that effective, but when I did it, it was highly disruptive. My opponent had to move around the other side of the objective or the obscuring terrain. And that put a lot of pressure on them and basically delayed their plans by one turn. All for a 90-point unit. So very clutch unit and honestly one of the keystones of scoring victory points in this list. Okay, so moving on, we have 2 Vipers, which are essentially meant for body blocking, creating disruption, and also scoring on secondary objectives like scout the enemy and scoring on things like behind enemy lines. We have 3 Wind Riders with, I know it doesn't say that there, but they're just base. They have shuriken catapults. And these are, again, just meant as a small, annoying objective style unit that can deal damage in the early game if it needs to, and then whenever it can get onto an objective pretty easily. Now, I don't have the scatter laser on this unit, but typically this unit would have a scatter laser. I just forgot to put it on somewhere in the list. I have 10 Warp Spiders with the Web of Deceit and Power Blades and additional Death Spinner. And basically this unit is a powerhouse unit meant to basically eliminate targets from objectives. It can eliminate pretty hard targets. It can even do decent damage against Terminators with the right buffs, and just basically use Web of Deceit right after that to get out of line of sight again. And then in the later game, of course, it can be used to capture objectives. It could be used to go in the enemy deployment zone and create disruption there and score victory points, again, on things like behind enemy lines. And lastly, for heavy support, we have 2 Fire Prisms with vectored engines. I was a little bit mixed at including these because I actually think that D cannons can do a very similar job for only slightly more points. So I was a little bit mixed with this, but I did choose to go with Fire Prisms because I think they essentially benefit better from Swift Strikes. In that, if you do have 2 Fire Prisms hiding behind a piece of terrain, you can always zip to another piece of terrain on the opposite side of your own board edge with Swift Strikes. You know, you could advance up to 6 inches. You can also use Battle Focus with vectored engines once per game and still be able to shoot and use linked fire and all that good stuff with them. So I figured these would be a cool kind of inclusion. And they perform a great job at dealing with large units. So vehicles, monsters, things like that. They're kind of less effective against certain things like demons and stuff, but we do have other tools that we can use in this list for demons, so I wasn't too worried about that. And this is also just great for popping guard tanks. I mean, Fire Prisms are essentially, along with Fire Dragons, very cost effective at popping things like Leman Russ battle tanks and then disappearing behind terrain. And you can essentially do this at all points in the game now because you do have Fire and Fade as an unlimited use stratagem once again. So you can use this every single turn if you wanted to keep your Fire Prisms safe, which makes them a lot better in my opinion. And that's basically it for the list. And in general, I mean, you could spend points on some relics, other relics, or warlord traits, but honestly, they're probably not really needed that much. I mean, you can give a Sunstorm, for example, to a Farseer if you thought you needed it or something like that. We do have the extra command points to spend now that the detachments are free in general. But you have a little bit of everything in this list, and you have a high potential of scoring points on Linebreaker. Or, again, not Linebreaker, sorry, behind enemy lines. I keep calling it Linebreaker back from a past expansion. But, yeah, basically, you have a lot of points potential you can score on that. You have the option of using Scout the Enemy on several units. And also, a lot of the killing objectives are slightly better now. So, especially with the amount of uninteractiveness that a couple of units have in this army will make it extremely difficult for enemy armies to actually kill them. So in most of our games, we should have a good amount of units left on the table, and we should be able to kill more enemy units than they can kill of us, especially with the points reductions that have swept across Marine factions now that they're easier to kill and that there's more of them. We're going to be getting a lot more out of that grind them down objective. So I think, again, you do have to score that every single turn to get the full 15 points out of it. That is true. But you should be able to do this. And if you're smart about what you kill, don't kill everything that you can all the time if you don't need to on certain turns. So for example, if you're in the last couple of turns and there's an easy unit to kill that's not on an objective, it's not threatening points or anything like that, maybe don't kill it unless you have to, right? Maybe don't kill it until turn 5 when you can successfully guarantee that by you killing that unit and your opponent not being able to threaten anything or kill anything in return, you're going to get those points in that last turn as well. And of course, with this list, there is a couple of objectives that it does a lot better, like behind enemy lines, scout the enemy and things like that. But always be open, because sometimes you never know. Maybe your opponent brings a lot of characters. Like he's an Imperial Guard player and he brings, 8 or 9 characters with him, and you can score easily on the assassinate secondary objective. Or maybe he has a ton of tanks on the field and you can easily score on bring it down. Stuff like that. So just keep your options open. Make sure that you know your opponent and choose your objectives accordingly, because this list is actually pretty flexible with what it can do. And lists like this are, again, pretty flexible with the kinds of objectives that they can have success with. So in conclusion, I think Swift Strikes and Masterful Shots was a pretty great combo before the Arcs of Omen changes. And despite the nerf to Swooping Hawks and the kind of nerf to that, Swooping Hawk spam list, I think with the additional fast attack slots and the lack of a troop tax, it's looking to be a lot stronger if you're not aiming to still spam Swooping Hawks. Again, I think that Swooping Hawks are a great unit, but, if you are spamming them, you're not going to get most of the benefits of not having to include troops in your list anymore. So I think the combo is still working. I think there's a lot of units that benefit greatly from it. They can score very easy points on objectives at all points in the game, either on behind enemy lines or scout the enemy and things like that, as well as doing very considerable damage while doing so. And again, right, it can target units that are pretty much unreachable for any other army out there. And being able to move 22 inches on top of a D6 battle focus roll, which can be rerolled, is a great way to not only score on secondary objectives, but also block charge lanes, block movement from your enemy, and basically stop your opponent from doing what they want to do and get onto the objectives that they want to get on in the first place. And the units that can do this very effectively, like Shroud Runners, are very cheap, and so are Wind Riders, right? 90 points for a unit of minimum Shroud Runners now, and 60 points for a unit of minimum Wind Riders, right? So very cheap units that can perform that and really, and again, Vipers too. I failed to even mention Vipers, but they can do it as well. And these units can really mess up your opponent's plans. And the units that can do this very effectively, like Shroud Runners and Wind Riders, are only 90 and 60 points respectively for minimum units, which is a very cheap way to block up a lot of your enemy's movement and stuff like that. Not a lot of factions have access to that. So that's a very positive thing. And I think that overall, this build has a lot of potential to still be very powerful. And just a quick note on some of the other competitive Eldar builds that were, running in the tournament scene before the changes. Some people are saying, including my Uthway buddy, that his list is now basically worthless because of the lack or loss of Hidden Path. And I actually don't quite think that. I think that we just need to look at other options for those types of lists. So for Uthway, I'm going to do a video on Uthway pretty soon covering them and basically where the whole denial strategy stands as far as that goes with the loss of Hidden Path. I think Hidden Path was a great objective, but it wasn't always usable. There were some missions where you just couldn't use it. And I think that's really where you had to kind of look elsewhere. And I still had success even when I wasn't using Hidden Path on, in certain games that it just wasn't possible to use it in, right? And again, I think we just kind of have to retool those armies a little bit to focus and broaden their scope as far as what objectives are going to be powerful for it. And again, like I said, with Uthway in particular, you know, you have a lot of support weapons, you have D-cannons and things like that in your list, which are very good at taking out targets. Grind them down is good in that kind of denial list as well, where you shouldn't be losing too many units per turn, being able to, you know, use fire and fade and stay behind terrain. And also, on the other hand, you know, unless you're facing something like Imperial Knights, where you don't have that many models that you're fighting against, you should be able to pick up more enemy units than they are of yours. So I do think those lists are still viable. Obviously, they need to make some tweaks and some changes here and there, I believe. But overall, I do think those lists can still have a lot of success. And also, I'm going to be coming up with a Biel-Tan video pretty soon too as well, by the way. I'm currently in the process of kind of doing a couple of Biel-Tan practice games. So look forward to that. I will go ahead and give you guys my thoughts on the Biel-Tan in this edition, which overall I think is good. Even though they took a hit to Swooping Hawks, I think Biel-Tan and the strength of Biel-Tan really relies more on a heavily aggressive Alpha Strike style of combat and list versus, you know, a denial and hide and seek kind of play style. But anyway, that's just me. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Peace out. I'll see you guys later. Leave a comment in the comment section if you want to, you know, discuss Swift Strikes and Masterful Shots and where you think it is now in the current game. Oh, and one more thing before we go today. I do want to mention to you guys, I did set up a Patreon after kind of debating it for quite a few months. Originally I didn't want to do it, but I think that, you know, it could be helpful to support the channel going forward. And I really want to do some cool new things and, you know, make some cool new graphics with you guys and stuff for the channel to make it a little bit better. And I can't really do that with the current equipment that I have. For example, I'm literally recording this video on my iPhone and, you know, you guys can probably tell every once in a while there's a little bit of a hiccup here and there, or there's a car vrooming in the distance or some stuff like that. I want to really eliminate that from my videos, so I did want to kind of invest in a couple more things so that I could make the videos more clear and, you know, less annoying in certain ways for you guys. So I am going to set that up, obviously completely optional. You don't absolutely have to do that. I don't think that I will ever push that on you guys. I never want to push, you know, basically donating to keep up content and things like that. That's not going to happen. The channel is going to remain the same. The content's going to basically be the same pace. The only difference is that, you know, for people who are supporters, you know, and if they want a video done on a certain topic, I'm more than happy to do that. And I'm kind of more than happy to do that now, for example. I know I've done a lot of, you know, subscriber inspired videos and stuff like that. So the link's going to be in the description if you guys are interested for the Patreon. I set it up at 2 levels, but, you know, feel free to, you know, just if you want to toss in 25 cents or whatever you think is, you know, fair or whatever. If you want to support it, I'd greatly appreciate it. And I think I have 2 levels right now, a $2 a month level, which is, you know, just general support. And, you know, obviously, you know, whatever, you know, requests you guys want, I'm open to them. And then I have an $8 a month level, which will include basically guaranteed video suggestions. So if a Patreon suggests a video to do, I will do it. I'll make it kind of more of a priority in addition to my regular content, of course. And I will also make sure that, you know, if they need any list advice or anything like that, that's also a priority as well. So again, you know, nothing changes though. If you guys want list tips, I'm going to give you guys tips always because I think it's helpful for the community. I want to keep it as free and open as possible. But I also want to be able to start, you know, building up money to save for investments in this channel. I want to reinvest that money right back into the channel to improve the quality of the videos that you guys are seeing. All right, everybody, that's going to be it. I'm not going to press that every video. I'm not probably going to mention it that often, but the link will be in the description. Have a good one, everybody. I'll see you later and more content to come this week. Have a great one, everybody. Peace out.